Starting the session soon, the session titled Desire for Social Change in the Developing World. The moderator for the session would be Shaheen, Shaheen Salahuddin, who is a renowned journalist. She has been a TV anchor. She's been associated with Indus News Network, and she would be moderating the session with the great speakers that we have. So we'll be starting in around 5 minutes. Please stay tuned.
Change in the developing world. I'm your moderator, Shaheen Salahuddin. I was the first head of the first private news channel in Pakistan. I've done several thousands of television shows. Joining me today is a wonderful panel we have today. Joining me from London is Dr. Laleh Khaleli, Professor of International Politics at Queen Mary University, London. She formerly a Professor of Middle Eastern Politics at the School of Arabian and African Studies, University of London. Also author of Heroes and Martyrs of Palestine, The Politics of National Commemoration, Time in the Shadows, Confinement and the Counter-Insurgencies, and Sanjos of War and Trade. Also joining us, Raza Rumi, a very familiar face for the Pakistani viewers and television viewers especially. Raza is right now in New York, if I'm not wrong. He's joining us from America. He is a visiting faculty at the Cornell Institute for Public Affairs and has taught earlier at various colleges, including NYU. He's also worked as a TV editor for various channels in Pakistan. And Dr. Nazir Hussain, a professor of international relations and former dean, Faculty of Social Sciences at Quaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad. He has 30 years of teaching, research, and administrative experience, and also familiar face for the television viewers. So I welcome all of you in the session. A topic, as I said earlier, the desire for social change in the developing world. Social change is always the result of human interaction and relationship that transforms culture, social institution. It is the need of the hour, but it takes time. It encourages individuals to take a stand against things that they find wrong and work with other people to remove them from society. Positive social change results in betterment of improving human and social conditions. These changes occur at many levels: families, friends, communities, organizations, local, state, and federal. Some examples of great social changes: abolition of transatlantic slave trade, civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the LGBT rights movement, the Green. Common causes of social changes. Of course, we are going to discuss with the panel, but some I can mention: technology, social institutions, population, environments. So what provokes social changes? What is the social change in today's world? And also, developing world, what is it passing through? What kind of changes it is expecting, especially in the post-COVID? I'll come to you, Dr. Laleh, first. And my question will be, what is the social change in today's world? What do we expect? What is it? Is it just the word social change, or gradually changes have occurred so much that we're all confused today?
Thank you very much for coming to me first. I'm very grateful to be on this panel and very sad not to be in Karachi, given that it's an extraordinarily vibrant and amazing city, and I wish I could be there. It's a really interesting question that you ask, because as the daughter of revolutionaries who grew up in Iran at the time of a revolution, of course, the immediate event that comes to mind and thinking about what could be so utterly transformative as the Iranian Revolution. It shifted not only the regime in Iran, but it also resulted in transformations in the relationship between different social classes. It resulted in the extension of a series of social goods and allocation of things like everything from electricity to education to rural areas that had been neglected before the revolution. But it also resulted in transformations in gender relations, which were on last study could in some ways be detrimental while also expansive in other ways. So to give you, for example, one example would be that on the one hand, you had the enforcement of certain regulations and laws that acted to the detriment of women. For example, they had to get permission in order to travel. For example, they had to sort of give up some of the equities in divorce or inheritance. But at the same time, the revolutionary period resulted in massive transformations in the status of women, for example, in rural areas, an expansion of literacy and the radical reduction in sort of deaths in childbirth and other kinds of health detriments. So on the one hand, there's this massive revolutionary transformation. And as you also named the books that I have written, my first book is about Palestinian struggles over the course of the last 7 or 8 decades. And so you also see these forms of revolutionary movements that are taking place in ways that don't result in massive transformations, despite the fact that the struggle goes on for years and years and years and years and constantly shifts between different geographies, from refugee camps to the West Bank to the diaspora to inside the Green Line in Israel. And so these kinds of radical revolutionary social changes take place alongside transformations that I think come about much more slowly in a much more sometimes structural, for structural transformations. You mentioned technological change, but beyond technological change, it is also generational transformations where one generation shifts and the next generation finds itself faced with different sets of problems. I live in London, where some of the major problems today that the kids, my wonderful students, but my own children as well, are facing and are trying to struggle against are the particular forms of racism that are enacted on a day-to-day basis, for example, by the police or at the borders. And that's what they're struggling against. And so what I find is that as I'm interacting with my students or with my children, the kinds of questions that they're asking is less about those forms of revolutionary change and more about forms of mobilizing at local level or at national level, but against these very specific forms of carcerality and police violence and state coercion. And so I think that those kinds of contextual and contextually dependent forms of transformation and change are quite fascinating and really difficult to put all under one title, to say that this is the only thing that is kind of happening, because I do think that forms of grassroots mobilization, forms of organizing around a particular cause tend to be very much structured by the environment in which those forms of social organizing happen. And I, again, maybe because I'm the daughter of revolutionaries, maybe because I lived through a revolution, I do tend to think that those transformations tend to be much longer lasting and effective when they do rise from below and when they manage to change the structures from below.
So, Raza, what Laleh just said, it seems to me that meaning of social change in today's world, in developed world, is totally different from developing world. You agree with that, and why it is so?
Well, I think yes, the contexts are different, and the kind of issues that countries and regions face may vary, but the processes are pretty much. I would say there's a broad similarity. So historically, what has spurred social change? I mean, technological innovations, economic structures changing, and the means of production. If we go to classical theories, they've always contributed to that. However, I suppose in the times that we live in, certainly there are other factors. I mean, in particular, external factors are also drivers of social change, and that is perhaps the point of distinction that you may like to draw here, Shaheen Sahiba, because I mean, historically, the world was not that interdependent, and especially in the post-globalization phase. I mean, despite all the problems with globalization, there is a major impetus within the developing world for not only changing the basic structures, the oppressive structures. So if you see the entire episode of Arab Spring, I mean, more than a decade ago, how it turned into a major catalyst for change. Of course, what happened later is another unfortunate chapter when Arab Spring turned into Arab Winter. But certainly the mobilization of young people aided by technology did spur an unprecedented expression of political disquiet, as well as a recourse to ideas such as democracy or representation or inclusion that were earlier missing. I mean, if you look at the case of Pakistan, what we have witnessed in the past few decades is absolutely amazing. The number of women who are in higher education universities, especially public sector universities, is unprecedented. In some universities, they're over more than 50%. And if you look at just, and how is that coming about? Part of that has to do with, changing values. It also has to do with the fact that urbanization at a fast pace is bringing a lot of women into the job market, and also into the sort of marketplace, because it is an economic necessity. So what the conservatism that we saw, let's say 40, 50 years ago, is now giving way to a more nuanced idea of an inclusive economic and household level environment. So I would say that, the ideas of social change remain pretty much, or the basics remain the same. But I guess in recent decades, we have seen different cases and different means whereby these changes have occurred. Yeah.
Before I go to Dr. Nazir, I just want to add, don't you think media played a tremendous role in bringing social change, especially for women? Because women and girls working late night on television, which wasn't there before, except the doctors were accepted. The lady doctors to hospital and coming back. Now the lady girls working at night shows at 11 and 10, and it's just a normal part.
Yes, I think I agree with you. It played a very important role, and also the fact that the number of women that we see on television screens, for example, I mean, that by itself is a big marker. It wasn't the case earlier with journalists. I mean, you would know better how like other spheres of activity, it has been male dominated in Pakistan, but not since last 2 decades or so. But yeah, I mean, we can talk more about this.
So, Dr. Nazir, what sort of social change are you seeing in development at the moment, especially post-COVID?
Very important question to ask. But first of all, I tend to agree with both of my colleagues in the panel. 2 words, and then I'll come to your question. This social change is a very broad term. It's not, unfortunately, specific to one region. Probably in the developing world, we have 2 basic issues, as Raza Rumi highlighted: the women emancipation, which Pakistan has witnessed over the last few decades. But if you go all around, as Ms. Laleh would agree with me, in the entire Arab world, this women emancipation problem has remained throughout. And good to know that during the Arab Spring, it were the women, the female, who were spearheading the all activities in all the 11 or 12 states where this Arab revolution did occur. But I'm glad you raised this issue of media. I'll go to another aspect, and that is social media. I think the the social media has brought a lot of changes in the human life, in the individualistic life, in collective life, in societal life. This has unprecedented role of social media, all aspects of social media. Even the advent of smartphone has revolutionized how fast one change goes across the globe. And if you specifically are saying the post-COVID era, I think this has brought about a new change, a new social change. Social distancing has become the norm of the day, whether we accept it or not, whether we practice it or not. But it is an important aspect of social change. And then a new terminology, both of my colleagues would agree, the new norm. And the new norm is you have to have the mask, you have to have distances, you don't need to shake hands like the Arabs and the Persians. They'll bow and they pay their respect. So these are the social changes which have been compelled by a certain kind of an environment. So yes, evolutionary changes are almost there, but the circumstances, the environment, whether you call it a political environment, whether you call it a social environment, that do affect the humanistic life in all individuals. And I think the pandemic of COVID-19 has brought us closer through this the social media, whether through this StreamYard or through Zoom, Teams, whatever you call. Now, Ms. Laleh is sitting in London, Raza Rumi is sitting in New York, I'm sitting in Islamabad, and probably you are sitting in Canada, you are in Karachi.
Karachi, I'm very much in Karachi.
So distances have also shrunk. So this is another social change. We don't feel, as previously in one of the topics, probably Raza Rumi discussed this. I watched one of the programs. Borderless. Now the world is not confined into borders. It's borderless. You can, the news travels so much, and the social change also travels so much. I think our new generation, the generation which is now in early teens, they are much more aware than us about the changes, as Ms. Laleh was referring to her own children, her own students. This is a very important aspect. And I'm glad that the Karachi Literary Festival and we are talking about the social change, because each and everything starts from a change, from a social compulsion, from a social need. So I think multiple factor, technology, social media, media itself, the advent of this COVID pandemic, and all these are important tools in order to bring the social change.
Can I jump in for a moment? Because I also want to actually caution that we don't necessarily, that we be careful about the kind of changes that are happening. Because one of the things that is really striking to me is that on the one hand, while it's wonderful to be able to sit here and speak to all of you from four corners of the world, at the same time, what I have discovered is that the forms of virtual connection that we establish here, actually, they tend to undermine real connections. So on the one hand, social media might be providing the basis of us speaking much more easily to with each other. But friends of mine who are organizing around questions of labor, around feminist issues, around LGBT issues, around anti-carceral, anti-police, abolitionist issues, they all find that actually in-person, face-to-face interaction works better. With our students, I know that the degree of anxiety, depression, and isolation among them increases with the forms of connection that happens in the virtual world. And I also want to add that perhaps just as the Arab spring has led to Arab winter in this quite depressing but very accurate metaphor for the uprisings that happened in the Arab world, one of the depressing things that we're also seeing is that what actually seems to be borderlessly traveling is right-wing sentiments and modes of organizing and tactics and strategies of organizing. And so what we see is different kinds of right-wing groups who actually want to turn those forms of social change, those forms of positive and progressive change, in particular in areas having to do with gender and sexuality, questions of race and class, are actually also connecting across the sort of virtual and other forms of media and learning from one another. And I think that in a sense, we do need to be very aware, we do need to be very alive to the possibility that actually progressive forces the forces that want to see change for good are not necessarily in a position that they could sort of beat out the more conservative forces of status quo or in fact reaction.
So what are the main obstacles you see in bringing social change in the developing world? What are the main obstacles today also? Keep in mind South Asia, Central Asia, India, Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan. Let's focus on this. What are the main obstacles today?
I would say that sort of the main obstacles are multifold. Of course, there's the old sort of unequal, asymmetric global relations, where existing sort of major powers tend to still exercise. I mean, we're speaking at a time where, for example, we've got a major war happening just north of where you guys are sitting, and we've got ongoing conflicts going on in the Middle East and elsewhere. There's sort of border skirmishes and tensions between India and Pakistan. There's the Indian incursion into Kashmir. There's the continued Israeli suppression of Palestinians within China and Myanmar. There's the continued suppression of the minority populations, the Uyghurs and the Rohingya. And so in a sense, what we're seeing is the kinds of both external and internal power politics that tend to suppress particular communities. That's the number one. And number two is, of course, the old school capitalist exploitation, which benefits some countries, and within those countries, some classes much more than others. And I think the one of the things that COVID has actually been extraordinary about is that the extent to which it has widened the gulf between the rich and the poor within countries, but also between the different countries in the world. So we see the vaccine apartheid, for example, where the European countries that have produced the vaccine have access to COVID vaccine, whereas countries that are poorer do not have necessarily the facilities or the resources to access that vaccine. So we have this global sort of separation, this global gulf. And then within countries, we see the billionaires becoming richer and richer and richer, while the COVID disproportionately affecting the poor and in the global north, people of color. And so I think that in some ways, the old scourges of inequality which used to be obstacles to social change, which have remained have continued to remain obstacles to social change. And I would say imperial power, capital production, capitalist modes of production or class relations, but also very repressive autocratic governments. You know, the baddies continue to be the same baddies.
So Raza, what Laleh just said, I wanted to talk about it, but I'd like to come to Nicholas Byrne, US ambassador to NATO. He once said about coronavirus, he said, it's potentially as serious as a world war. Now we are seeing what Ukraine is going through, what Russian crisis, what nuclear alerts taking place around the world. Are these going to create serious hurdles for social change around the world, due to economic crisis, due to political crisis? I don't know. How optimistic are you?
I'm about this. I'm not optimistic at all, because unfortunately, given the tensions that are mounting, you know, this is such a. I mean, this whole episode is also a very timely reminder of the scare and the futility of nuclear weapons, you know, and how dangerous they are to our planet and our futures, you know, our children and their children, because, you know, at some point they could be used. I mean, we have seen in the past, I mean, there are examples when they were used, unfortunately. But, you know, aside from that, what I do, but then this would also trigger more changes. I mean, you know, also what is happening is that the global relations, I mean, are also changing. I mean, you know, the world is fast moving from a unipolar sort of idea of a world to a multipolar power centers, and that will create more conflict, of course, in the short to medium term. But it would also mean that, you know, it will no longer be the kind of international order that we are used to for the past few decades. I mean, the way China and Russia are exerting their increasing power, vis-a-vis the US and what we call the West, So that's also going to undergo transformation. But I think one of the points that I wanted to bring about, and this is from the earlier part of our discussion, is the importance of social movements. I mean, how social movements have contributed to social change, to structural change in so many parts. I mean, that's one lesson of human history that or at least in contemporary history, that I personally find is an impetus for change. And, I mean, I'm in the US, and I have, since I've been here, I've witnessed the Black Lives Matter movement evolve and shape. And in 2020, how when, this young African-American man was brutally killed by a policeman, and how that sparked a global protest. I mean, both in the UK where Laleh is, but also in other parts of the world, Latin America, countries you would not think would be spurred by that. So in a way, that's also linked to the kind of world that we are inhabitants of today. And I think if we come back to Pakistan, I mean, the most interesting thing, I mean, and because, as you said, Shaheen, that that the Pakistani audience, I have to cater to them as well. But the three social movements currently that are really inspirational. I mean, first is the Aurat March, women's marches since last few years. Every March, they organize these rallies in different urban centers of Pakistan, small and big and medium sized. And, that has created such a furore. And the right-wing backlash, what Laleh was earlier mentioning, and then so social media is used to transmit those ideologies as well. But, this is something that is fascinating, and the level of awareness that it has created in younger women and men, for that matter, is unprecedented. And the second one, I mean, I would also refer to the young Pashtuns sort of highlighting the plight of people in the northwest of the country, those who have suffered during the war on terror, both drone attacks, security operations, homelessness, displacement, internal migration and refugees, and police excesses. We have I mean, that's how the movement generated. Of course, it has been suppressed by the state, and many elements of the state find it anti-state or anti-Pakistan, but in a way it has contributed to a discourse which is again was much needed. I mean, and that's about constitutionalism in Pakistan. And the third example I would like to cite is the students organizing. I mean, we've just seen in Sindh that the Sindh Assembly passed. There are no student unions in Pakistan now. One can have an argument for pros and cons of that, but you can't really have an idea of a functional democracy without student bodies. And these young students are carrying out these rallies, carrying out these protests, and they also link their demands with the need for better quality public sector higher education. What happens within the universities, issues of sexual harassment, subsidies, budget cuts, because we're also living in times of austerity, where this so-called neoliberal paradigm is forcing everyone to cut public sector funding, I mean, across the world for education and other services. And so these three examples, you will find their different dimensions and different facets everywhere, actually, both in the developed world as well as in the developing countries. So in a way, I would say that, internationally, this is a very interesting and exciting time, despite all the major obstacles that we also face. Yeah.
Raza, I agree with you. These are the positive changes. But to me, I'm really hurt what is happening in South Asia, especially in India. I was a great admirer. I used to go every year with Asma Jahangir and late Val Heather and across the border and for all these things. But the rise of RSS and what is happening with the minorities. I don't want to bring it a political way. I'm talking about social. India, a secular state, is it, that is shocking for me, that I see secularism going down, bringing India down. It's a country, let's accept. Fanaticism also raised in Pakistan, I agree. But let's talk about it. Why do you think these are the negative social effects in South Asia?
I'll quickly comment. I know others have to weigh in, both Dr. Laleh and Professor Nazir. But I think if you see, this is again a global virus, I call it, authoritarianism and majoritarianism. So whether you see what is happening in India, or for that matter to a great degree even in Bangladesh, which is ostensibly a democracy, but you have an iron sort of hand kind of governance there. And you see that happening in Turkey, you see that happening in the Philippines, in the United States, where Dr. Laleh is, with Boris Johnson's antics, they are, and the rising Islamophobia and this whole, race tensions, racial tensions in the UK. So it is again a very strange, and I think it's very much linked, Shaheen Sahiba, to the rising inequality. Fundamentally, I think that the world has never been that unequal in terms of income and wealth distribution as it is now for over a century. And it's this acute, kind of inequality that is one of the major drivers. Of course, there are many other factors which are locally spurred. But if you look at the US, with the top 1% of the 1% of the rich controlling half the wealth. I mean, same is the case with India, if you look at the figures and in other parts of the world. So there's this whole concentration of capital, power, and individual authoritarian model. Now, that is happening. At the same time, there's also unprecedented resistance. So you mentioned India, the way farmers organized this protest. I mean, it is also amazing. In really bitter cold winter, for months and months they didn't give up. And then we saw a year before they were going to change this. They changed the immigration laws and the Muslims coming from Bangladesh, and that spurred a whole thing on identity and who's an Indian and who's not an Indian. And once again, you had these really Shahbag protests, which were also unprecedented. So there is a pushback as well. While we face the most wild and unfortunate and tragic face of extremism in India, we also see that there's a big pushback going on as well. So I will take a measured line here. And I think ultimately the pendulum which has swung the other way will come somewhere in the middle or whatever. And that's why social movements and organizing and in-person organizing, what Laleh mentioned, is so vital. I mean, online activism is good, but it cannot fully be a substitute for the, organizing on ground.
Okay. Dr. Nazir, the positive and negative impact of social movements, of social change. How do you see at the moment South and Central Asia?
Unfortunately, though, these two regions are a little bit different, although they are culturally close. Linguistically, if you say yes, close to the Iranians, the Persians, and the Daris, and then our Pashtuns. But definitely, in terms of the positivity and negativity, there are many examples. Like, still, I don't want to be political, but still in Central Asia, the dominance of the former Soviet Union, its culture, its traditions, its political role is still there. You cannot just dig it out. You cannot ignore it. In South Asia, we do have this issue of colonialism, being the old under the yoke of the Britishers. Sorry, Ms. Laleh, for this yoke of the. But definitely, we are still trying to carve out, niche out our own role in the social change structure. As Raza Rumi mentioned, the role of the majoritarianism. Like, see, the entire West is suffering that. We have been hearing that, okay, we believe in equality, we believe in tolerance, we believe in this, that. I've been to Germany, I've been to London, I've been to several other states, but restricted immigration is allowed. White supremacy is dominant. I don't want to be racial, but these are the issues. Like in the United States, where Mr. Raza is sitting, see Mr. Trump, what he did. America first. America first meaning thereby, I may be wrong, America first meaning thereby the supremacy of the white American. So that led to the social movement, as Raza Rumi was saying. So in terms of Central Asia and in terms of South Asia, there are certain negativities. Like even today, if you go some parts of the South Asia, I'm talking about regardless any Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Pakistan.
Uh-oh, you're on mute. Sorry, you've been muted.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you, so I'm just waiting.
No, I'm so I'm saying from Afghanistan to Pakistan to Bangladesh and to India, we are still suffering from the same dogmatic rule of the old generations, which are trying to make an obstacle to the social change. As you were mentioning before, that what are the obstacles of the old traditions are still the major obstacle in bringing about the change. I'm talking about.
What are the instruments of change? Let me inject here. What are the instruments of change then? You said they're obstacles, but what are the new instruments of change that can force and push them back?
Number one, I told you, we are living in a borderless world where ideas are coming very instantly. There is no barrier to the ideas. The social media is creating that. Yes, as mentioned by Raza, there are social movements, but these are physical. The first and the foremost is to create an idea in the minds and the hearts of the young. And I think, let me go back to the Arab Spring. What Arab Spring sparked? A social movement, what sparked? In Algeria, basically, and then it went up. So what were the instrument? It was Twitter, it was smartphone, it was Facebook, etc. So the young generation is the major instrument of bringing the social change. And mind you, in this South Asian, where 1/5 of the humanity lives, majority are under the age of 35. So they are the harbinger of change in the society. Now, in South Asia, there may be a different change, but in Central Asia, there is a different change. But the positivities and negativities do work together to bring about a different change. One of the fundamental obstacle which probably is there is still the old dogmatic thinking of we don't want to change. I mean, I'm not against burqa, but still see burqa in a tradition sense is still a major issue in many parts of Pakistan, in many parts of Bangladesh, and many parts of Afghanistan. And then, of course, we can bring about this polio movement, which is being run by Mr. Bill Gates in order to reduce the polio effects in both Bangladesh and in Pakistan. But see these resistance, see how much obstacle are being created by those old dogmatic forces. But one fundamental aspect which must be highlighted by all of us is that a change is permanent. It will be brought, whether it is social change, whether it is political change, or whether it is economic change. Definitely only 0.01% of the entire world consumes inherits the wealth of the people, but see what is going on and what would be there in the near future.
So Laleh, these telephone cells that we hold in a hand, don't you think this is becoming a main factor in changing the economics of today's youth? Because they can work, there are so many apps that they apply in order to get the job, especially during the COVID, and scientific technological advancements are now on the way to employ the youth today from anywhere, remote area, as long as you have a Wi-Fi, you have this thing. Do you think that can bring change and change for betterment in the third world?
So I think that often the kind of the attribution of transformative power to the whether social media or technology tends to mix up this as a tool of the other actually fundamental causes of transformation rather than just as a tool. I mean, one of the stories that I really love telling is that part of the massive organization in Egypt that led to the overthrow of Mubarak actually happened over old school phones, because in fact the Mubarak regime shut down the internet for X many days. So that's number one. Number two, one of the things that people often bring up is, for example, the use of the mobile phone as both a banking device and various other kinds of tools in Africa, where infrastructures for forms of grounded telecommunication tends to be much more difficult to actually implement. And so people tend to use mobile telephony a lot more. But that hasn't necessarily led to a widening of the economy or in political engagement. And as I also mentioned, social media can be as much a platform for the fascists and the right-wingers as it can for the left-wingers. I think my sense is that what happens here is, I mean, I'm kind of old school Marxist thinking. Antonio Gramsci, the great Italian Marxist thinker who spent most of his life in prison, famously said, and he was writing about the interwar period, that a world has ended and a new one is yet to begin. And this interregnum is a time of monsters or time of morbid symptoms. My sense is that we're also in an interregnum. And I don't want to separate out the political from the social, because I do think that those two things are completely and intimately interconnected, along with the economic. So I think that it has a moment of transformation is happening. In this moment of transformation, what we're seeing is an intensification of inequality. We're seeing a shift from sort of the neoliberal policies in which the state was completely and totally in the service of capital to a demand for a state that serves public better. And that demand comes from both the right and the left. And we have a sort of a sense that something else needs to be happening in order for a better future to be had by all. But we don't know what that is yet. And I think that some of the failures that actually defined the Arab uprisings of 2011 are those that we need to pay attention to. So yes, the Arab uprisings were in many instances led by women. The role of the youth was extraordinarily prevalent, whether they were students or working youth. I mean, the guy who actually self-immolated in Tunisia was a vegetable seller. And so he wasn't a middle-class, well-educated kid. But what you found actually, that while the telegenic middle-class youth of Cairo gathered up in Tahrir Square, you also had working-class youth running fights with the police in places like Suez and Port Said and elsewhere. And so I think that all of those things are really exciting, but some of those failures are also, we need to pay attention to them. The first and foremost is the extent to which those in power will deploy violence in order to hang on to their power, whether that power is the power of property or the power of the state. The second, and I think it's quite significant, is also we have to pay attention to the fact that there needs to be political organizing on the ground. You need to have political parties. You need to have durable, lasting forms of social relation and new tactics and strategies that allow for different categories of people to come together and work together. One of the things that made, for example, the uprisings, the Black Lives Matter uprisings, particularly salient in some places in the global north, was the fact that the youth actually organized with the unions. What we saw for the mention of the farmers movement in India is particularly also salient, because while the farmers movement were happening, a lot of lefty kids were also representing those movements. And so you were seeing actually students at JNU who were being beaten up over anti-student stuff were also representing representing the farmers' movement, totally socially different, totally geographically distant places, but at the same time, sort of combining in these particular forms of coalition building. And I think that those new those forms of coalition building, those new modalities of organizing need to work together. Women's movements need to work alongside the youth movements for democracy or for other forms of movements along labor. But I think there needs to be also a reconsideration and revivification of forms of party political organization in order for those movements to have something grounded and concrete that would allow for the movements to remain durable and not flame out after a year or two and be subjected to the forms of violence and coercion that they have been elsewhere.
Raza, although I wanted to ask you about the America and the Trump era and social change that came in the US, but let me first come to the students' union. I hope they'll start in Pakistan's leader in Sindh, because the assembly has passed a resolution that student union can work. Do you think there's an optimistic, very optimistic, of course, I see it as a very optimistic, I'm very optimistic about it, but in the current scenario where political parties often use these student union for their purposes, and of course, ideologically, they support different political parties. In the current scenario, you're optimistic about it?
So, I mean, I think in what has been there, I mean, since more than, I mean, almost 40 years that the student unions were banned by General Zia, you know, during his rule, 11-year-old rule. And the problem is that, yes, there was campus violence, and yes, there is a possibility, and there are fears about that, but that require better legislation, that require better regulation, and a framework for students to work. You see, the problem is that, you know, we have now created 2 generations of depoliticized young minds. And the problem, and perhaps that suits the state, that perhaps that suits certain class interests. But, you know, we cannot think of a democratic polity where young people are not participating in political life and not learning about politics, because student unions, other than whatever they do on campus, is also a great tool and an environment to train them politically, to think them in terms of structures and change. And obviously, you know, what we have also allowed is that, you know, while all other student unions were banned, the right-wing unions were allowed to operate. You know, in some guise or form or the other, the ones which were allied to the state. So they have not gone anywhere. The others are not allowed to organize. So you see, so there's this whole imbalance that needs to be corrected. I mean, I think that would require, I mean, I'm in no position to say that, because Professor Nazir and others would be better suited to comment on that. That, you know, this is the university administration, the parliament, the local legislatures who have to come up with effective regulations. I mean, they're everywhere, in Sri Lanka, in India, in Bangladesh, in other parts of the world. Why not Pakistan? I mean, you know, they in the UK, for example, I studied in the UK. I joined many groups and many you know, political associations. I mean, that's how I learned a lot. So I guess we have to get there. We just can't ban things because they may have a possibility of spurring some violence or some fear. So I'm optimistic if it actually goes through. But then it really depends on our political parties, how serious they are in reviving these bodies. Yeah.
Dr. Nazir, obviously your comment on student bodies, but I also wanted to know about Aurat March. Why the right-wingers? I don't seem to understand what is their problem. Women who are coming out because they wanted to, their families agree, their husband, their brothers, everybody agreed. They are on the street as a human being. What is the problem with the right winger? What is the problem with the religious leaders? They're not coming for some religious, but they're coming for some social goals and aims. What is the problem?
First to your question about student union, during the old regime of Mashallah of Ziaul Haq, I was the vice president of my own department. I was nurtured, I was trained for a political or awareness, social awareness. That has gone, unfortunately, for the last 40 years. I'm for students' union. Definitely, they must be. Because unless you cannot train your youth for political culture, social change, economic disparities, awareness, so many things, it would not. And then, as Raza mentioned, they would find new avenues to vent out their feelings, whether it is rightist movement, whether it is some other movement. So I'm for it, and definitely, as mentioned, there is a strong legislation to be done. Administrative capacity should be enhanced. But one fundamental aspect between the Western unions, Western countries, Students' Union and Pakistani, are as Ms. Salahuddin, you mentioned very well, the role of the political parties. They use these as a tool. But unlike in the West is training the people. Where is the debating club of Oxford and Cambridge and so many other countries? Where are those debating clubs? Where are those political leaders? I can name many great leaders. Then is a Bhutto. She was from Oxford Debating Club and she was the president of the Oxford Student Union. So that is where we must bring in the change of nurturing our youth to be trained for political leadership, for social leadership and economic leadership. Having said that...
Before you go ahead, I have been to Delhi. I have sat in the Student Union of JNU, and I have seen Indian students struggling peacefully. So why can't our students in our universities do the same? It will take time.
No, see, two fundamental factors: the state intervention and, of course, the political intervention. These are, as many of you would agree, these are contradictories. Please, it is. I don't want to go into very long debate, but I think reference is enough. The state plays something else, and the political parties plays something else. That is fundamentally wrong with the Pakistani political parties and bring about a new cultural political awareness. I must give you one example. I'm not for any political party or for any political government. No, in 2018 elections, there was a change. There was a social change. The people from urban areas, the people from elite class, they came out for voting for certain political parties or for all political parties. They came out because there was a feeling of a change, of a political leadership. And then you see a massive turnout of ladies, gents, boys, girls from urbanite areas. And you know very well, I don't want to emphasize much, that Pakistani political culture is 95% rural-based political parties, vaderas, jagirdars, etc. So this was a social change, which brought about, we can disagree with so many other aspects, but this was another change which brought about. Now, coming to the Aurat March, I think I told you earlier, the major obstacle is those old set minds which don't want the emancipation, social, political, and economic emancipation of the woman. The feeling is there, the urge is there, the change is there, but these are the forces who would like to stop this, who would like to don't bring about change because, in their own homes, they don't want to bring change. So once
women have been going out in processions in political parties.
Agreed.
So if they are marching, saying with the Aurat March, I still don't understand. If it's a People's Party march, a lot of women there. If it's a PTI, a lot of women there. Look at PMLN, Mariam Aurangzeb, Mariam...
JUI even JUI, Mullah Fazl Rahman's political party.
What is the problem if she is out with the slogan? I still don't understand. I need a convincing answer, Doctor.
Mindset, nothing else. I think there is no other obstacle other than that once the woman would get emancipation, their role will be minimized, they will be marginalized. That's the only issue. For me, I think, as Raza mentioned, the women are now becoming the entrepreneurs, economic entrepreneurs, financial entrepreneurs. They are running the universities. They are running the full-fledged organizations. I mean, they are running even even the Chamber of Industries, Commerce and Industries in many cities. So they are coming up. And this is the fear being felt by the traditional mindset, whether you call it political mindset, whether you call it social mindset, whether you call it the Moderator politics, etc., etc. They are trying that this would bring according to their version, I'm not saying that, according to their version, this will bring about a social change which they would be unable to stop.
Laleh, I think Women March, of course, on one side. What is the condition of women in the developing world, and is it turning into for the better or for the worse?
I think that in different parts of the world, I would say, in different parts of the developing world, I would say that the condition of women is really different. And I think in part, I'm equivocating on this because the conditions are so different depending on where you are and what their factors are. But in almost everywhere that you think about, there are two broader causes, factors, shaping the extent to which women's conditions have improved or have not. The first is structural, the extent to which education is offered women, or women are educated, the extent to which women can enter the labor market or do enter the labor market because of the demands of capitalism. The transformations, for example, and the divide between the urban and rural, but also in the extent to which the kinds of infrastructures that are readily available in urban areas, whether they're health or education, but also other kinds of transportation, et cetera, are available to women. So that's the structural causes are enormously important. I know that in Iran, in the most conservative post-revolutionary moments, the very fact that education and healthcare was being extended to the rural areas, it really and fundamentally transformed the condition of women there, and that condition change resulted in changes in disposition. So that's the structural conditions are important. But the structural conditions will not shift, will not change on their own. You also need grassroots political mobilization, and that grassroots political mobilization is going to be very difficult, in particular in places where the sort of the upholding of the status quo, the upholding of the sort of the relations of power in place demands that women be subservient, whether in terms of how they act, but also where they are in their political and economic position, social position. And so I think that under those difficult conditions, it is really hard to organize. You still see women sort of organizing around women's rights in Iran being chucked into prison, or women who were organizing around driving, the right to drive in Saudi Arabia, being thrown in prison and tortured in Saudi Arabia, or women in actually the Arab uprisings being subjected to extremely invasive virginity tests, which verge on rape, essentially, by security services, precisely because they were out on the streets. And yet they continued to persist in going out there and organizing. And the job of organizing is not just being on the streets. It is also organizing in smaller groups. It's also in educating exactly what transformation in women's place and location means. It means in reaching out and providing a new language, a new vocabulary, and a new set of avenues for organization and mobilization to women who may not have that form of access and that form of ability. So that condition, both on the one hand, large scale, often quite invisible, slow-moving structural changes have to go hand in hand with much more expansive, organized social movements by women themselves.
Raza, Afghanistan, women's condition in Afghanistan. I don't know, I see a light at the end of the tunnel regarding women, because last time when Taliban came, before this period, they were women totally beggars. They couldn't go out, there was no possibility of a light at the end of the tunnel. This time, only yesterday or the day before yesterday, I was seeing that women are allowed now to go to a university. Why do you see this? How do you see this condition? And why do you think this mindset is still there?
I mean, it's a very complex question, the way it is. But I think what is happening now is that the Taliban are under immense pressure from the world and, from also domestically, because they realize that, if they are not going to, if they're going to repeat what they did in the 1990s, they would be internationally isolated, as well as they would face lots of domestic resistance. Again, it is linked to the fact that, since the US invasion of Afghanistan, there's a new generation, a whole new generation of young women, men who have come about and who are different from their previous generations in terms of their education, in terms of the kind of country they want, in their aspirations. And the Taliban realized that. As you know, changes and opening up is also happening in places like Saudi Arabia, which was such close societies until a few years ago. And the disquiet within the society, especially by young people, and it has been reported as well, people have documented a lot of anxiety and angst by young people in the kingdom. And so the current, king is responding to that. And I think the Taliban would sooner than later, will have to give up their stringent policies on women's education, and there are some signs of opening on that front, but it's a long way to go. It's not going to come about easily given their hardline ideological positioning, but it's a pressure from within which is also working. If you remember when they took over Kabul, the first protests that they faced were by these young women on the streets of Kabul and Herat and other places, who basically said, and in the case of Pakistan, if you remember, when General Ziaul Haq was in power, the first challenge to him came from Women Actions Forum, WAF. And they set the whole momentum going, a handful of feminists taking on a very mighty dictator, and then that spurred a political movement later in a few years. So I guess that's what's happening. That's how I see it. Maybe I'm sounding a bit optimistic and naive, but I am optimistic.
So how optimistic are you in contact with Pakistan? With Aurat March, you were very optimistic that they're going out. But as we have seen, there are people who are trying to reverse it, who are creating obstacles. And you never know, tomorrow there may be an announcement. I don't know, I'm just saying. Yeah. There can be an announcement saying that the march should not go on, it should not be there. I remember Etidad Hassan once very rightfully pointed out to me in one of my shows ages ago. The women wanted to do the marathon, and there were objections on that and probably not allowed something. So he said, these mullahs will never let women or men happy. They want to create obstacles. You think it's something to do with sadism, sadistic?
Of course, it has to do with control. In one word, how do you control the society? How do you control women's bodies? What they think, the way they should understand the world, the way they should view the world. And of course, that control gives the right wing, especially of the religious variety, this extraordinary hold over the society. Look at Pakistan, every little thing they object to. It's not just the Aurat March, but any innovation, any introduction, about the marriageable age of young girls, forced conversions. You name it, there's a long list of issues. Every time they come in and they resist that. But then we also seeing that it's very difficult for them to exercise that control. Because what we discussed earlier, women are everywhere. They're in the parliament. They're the most noisy, effective members of the parliament. They are on TV screens.
First women prime minister.
Yeah. women prime minister. They're in the political sphere. They are found, in all. They're in the police. There's a woman general in Pakistan. So how are they going to what extent are they going to?
A woman in this country, and still they think she's going to defend the country, but she can't defend herself on the road.
Yes.
Dr. Nazir, how would you like to conclude the social change in the developing world, because we're running short of time?
Positive aspects, not for negative aspects. Thank you.
Lala, last word from you. I can't hear you, Lala.
Muted.
Yeah. Laleh?
Apologies. I was having trouble turning the unmute. The final word that I want to say is that I have been the kind of the Cassandra, a little bit of a pessimist in here, but I think perhaps we should end with a note of optimism, and the very fact that despite all the obstacles that everybody, including myself to great length, have spoken about, we do see extraordinary changes at great cost and great sacrifice to women, perhaps gives us hope that change is possible. I am, after all, the daughter of revolutionaries. Let's hope that those kinds of revolutions happen in everyday life as well.
Rumi, your last words in this session?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both. I think the challenges are immense and huge, and by no means they are easy to undo. But at the same time, I think they're not insurmountable. And so many things in the recent, in the past century, show us. I mean, look at the case of the U.S. giving the voting rights to the African-American, although they're still trying to suppress the votes. But the end of segregation, the end of Jim Crow. I mean, if you look at these are major developments. Just in a span of 1 century, and of course, it's going to be slow-moving. It's going to be painful at a cost, but it is there. And I have great faith in the young people of today. I think they have far greater access to knowledge. They have far greater access to information, far greater means of organizing online and in person, and which was not really available, let's say, a few decades ago. And I think something will come out of that. Of course, there are obstacles, but we need to, look at the brighter side of the world.
Thank you very much for joining us in this session. I'm really honored to have you all in this in this panel. And with this, I come to an end of this program. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for tuning in to this session. Do visit us tomorrow as well. Tomorrow भी बहुत अच्छे sessions हैं within this room. नहीं virtual नहीं है.